In July, the Oregonian, the newspaper of record for the state, published an article under the headline "Majestic Douglas Fir Stood for 420 Years. Then Oregon State University foresters cut it down." In the article, it reported that Douglas Pollock had discovered the trees while out on a run. He was devastated. The conflict between developers and environmentalists is especially bitter in Oregon, where the vast forests and the timber they produce have historically been a central economic driver and a point of civic pride. And I show you here two slides. In the lower right is a clear cut in the shape of the United States, which is this is an old clear cut, 70 years old, as a marker of sort of the national pride of conquering the West. And in the upper left is an image from a streetcar in Portland from a few years ago, "Welcome to Oregon, home of the clear cut." So you have these two kind of conflicts, the one sort of civic pride and national pride in conquering nature, which has shifted to a form of protest. But as Pollock's response shows, for the average person going on a jog, the ecological destruction is not necessarily a point of economics or climate change. It's something deeply personal and emotional. Pollock was devastated. And a cursory awareness of the popular press makes clear that these emotions are not limited to Oregonians, but we can see them in grief over wildfires in Australia. The bushfire devastation, I think it was last year, caused collective grief. And an article about the ravaging of Amazonia in the New York Times, the eco-activist and author Vanessa Barbara writes that it's been heartbreaking to watch the country burn, both literally and figuratively, under Mr. Bolsonaro. Right now, Brazilians feel a collective, perplexed grief for everything we stand to lose, not only as Brazilians, but as humans. What hurts me most is the bare idea of the millions of Notre Dame, high cathedrals of terrestrial biodiversity burning to the ground. Barbara's language here is the language of lament. It's heartbreaking, perplexed grief, hurt. And the subject of her lament is an ecosystem, its trees and animals. The phrase that seems to be gaining traction to describe this emotion has been provided by the ecological psychologist Ashley Consolo and Neville Ellis in their article, "Ecological Grief as Mental Health Response to Climate Change-Related Loss." They define ecological grief as the grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. Consolo and Ellis then offer an archaeology of the term, writing that among the first to describe the emotional pain of experienced ecological loss was the ecologist and conservationist Aldo Leopold, who noted in 1953 that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Leopold is widely considered among the founders of the modern environmental movement in the United States, and this quote from his seminal book, A Sand County Almanac. This quote is from his seminal book, A Sand County Almanac. In it, Leopold reflects on the destruction to the ecology of rural Wisconsin in the wake of the development of heavy industry and industrial farming practices during the economic boom of the Cold War. Leopold's great insight was that the rise of the environmental movement depended on grief. The sadness we feel at watching precious and irreproducible natural environments be destroyed is what spurs us to protective action. Environmentalism and ecological grief are inseparable. As a Byzantinist, when I saw Consolo and Ellis attribute the origins of ecological grief to Leopold, I began to wonder, is ecological grief really a new modern emotion, a newly emergent affective state contingent upon new modern ecological circumstances? Or did Byzantines also feel sad when parts of their natural world were destroyed? And if they could feel ecological grief, did they? And under what circumstances? And would a Constantinopolitan of the 12th century feel it in the same way as Aldo Leopold, an American of the 20th century from rural Wisconsin? Certainly, Byzantines had emotional responses to nature. The rhetoric of delight, whether in the locus amoenus tradition or in hunting descriptions, is a central aspect of Byzantine encounters with nature. Take, for instance, Constantine Manassas. There he is. A noted author of the 12th century whose fame rests on his Synopsis Chroniki, a history of the world from biblical creation to the author's own time, but whose works also include a novel which survive in fragments, speeches, and ekphrases, descriptive passages of events or scenes. One of his ekphrases The description of a crane hunt describes the different kinds of hunts the author has seen, adding that, for me, the crane hunt is so much more pleasurable than all those other hunts. Again, the theme of pleasure and delight comes up. He delights in hunting, and in the crane hunt above all other hunts. The remainder of the ekphrasis then describes Manasseh's own experience of participating in one such hunt, during which he notes throughout the pleasure he takes in watching the suffering of animals. When the piercing cries of the cranes was heard and the cranes arrayed and organized themselves, one inciting the other to line up and make the phalanx dense, it was exactly then I saw and wondered at the laws of the hunt, and I rejoiced, aterphthin, like those who taste the lotus, and the event instilled pleasure, ghanos, in my soul. Later in the ekphrasis, he describes other kinds of bird hunts he's seen. I also rejoiced, eterpse, at a starling with black wings and a singing goldfinch, and the chattering siskin and other such birds, held by twigs covered in glue, wanting to escape and fluttering their wings, but prevented by those fluid bonds, and with hearts beating in their chests as if fighting for their lives. They were caught and pierced by a small knife and thrown in a basket, but some were kept alive, those to whom nature had given more abundant beauty. Manasseh here talks about the delight he gets from seeing a certain method of trapping birds, by which glue is placed on branches, and then when the birds land, they get trapped. Given the delight Manasseh takes in seeing birds trapped, hunted, and killed, it might seem something of a paradox that he also wrote a monody on the death of his goldfinch, in which he laments the death of his pet bird. It is now for me to see you dead, my dearest goldfinch, and to pour libations from the bowls of discourse over you lying there, and to exchange your sweet and siren-like chattering for funerary tunes. It is now for me to view the singing bird voiceless, the song-loving silent, the sweet voice speechless, and to tune the mournful lyre of discourse, to grieve over the sweet speaking, in lamenting echoes, and to sing a re-echoing dirge for the so delightful music-making birds. Woe, this bitter incident. So here we have two examples of birds dying, and yet Manasseh's response is very different. In the former, he sees dying birds and he rejoices, while on the other, he sees one bird die and he feels grief. What differentiates these two instances, of course, is Manasseh's personal positionality with regard to the dead birds. In the case of the former, they mean nothing to him, so he feels no grief. In the case of the latter, it was his personal beloved pet bird, and so he grieved. The distinction between the individual pet and the category of bird is one that also lies at the heart of contemporary animal rights discourses. And again, Aldo Leopold stands as a central figure for determining the contours of this debate. J. Baird Caldecott writes that, quote, the urgent concern of animal liberationists is for the suffering of domestic animals, towards which Leopold manifests an attitude which can be described only as indifferent. The urgent concern of Leopold, on the other hand, is for the disappearance of species of plants as well as animals, and for the soil erosion and stream pollution. These not only have very different ethical perspectives, but profoundly different cosmic visions as well, unquote. In this way, the comparison between Leopold and Manasseh takes on a relevance for understanding the conflict within contemporary discourses of eco-criticism and animal studies, since Manasseh is indifferent to species, but moved by the suffering of his domestic pet, while Leopold is moved by the destruction of species without focusing on any individual exemplar. In an uncanny parallel across the centuries, the crane is also one of the central animals in Leopold's lament for the environmental degradation of rural Wisconsin. Whereas Manasseh has his monody on the death of his goldfinch, a lament dedicated to an individual animal, Leopold's lament is called the, quote, marshland elegy, a lament for the whole ecosystem and for the animal species who live there. The elegy is in many ways a lament for the destruction of the crane population, which he calls, quote, wildness incarnate. And he concludes that, quote, someday perhaps, in the very process of our benefactions, perhaps in the fullness of geologic time, the last crane will trumpet his farewell and spiral skyward from the great marsh. And you can see that this sort of poetic invocation of ecological grief is accompanied by a romantic image of cranes against a sunset. So if Byzantines could feel grief for non-human animals in certain limited circumstances, could they also recognize the life and thus grieve for the death of plants as well? There was certainly no shortage of deforestation in the Byzantine Empire. And here I show tree stumps from the Great Palace Mosaic Museum. There was no shortage of deforestation in the empire. Nikitas Choniatis, for instance, describes how during what would prove to be John II Komnenos' fatal campaign in Antioch, quote, warfare against Christians he forbade, but the troops were allowed to pillage the suburbs of the city in which they were quartered and to carry off everything they could get their hands on. His excuse for this command was that there was a lack of supplies. Not even the fruit-bearing trees were left unharmed, but were given over to the flames for cooking. Nikitas might suggest some amount of admonishment, or even that this was unusual, but there seems to be no element of grief attached to the destruction of these fruit trees. Indeed, the burning of the trees receives no further mention, a lack of emotional response particularly significant, given that the narrative of John's death concludes with a plaintive and long-winded eulogy. Another instance of deforestation occurs later in the narrative, as Andronikos Komnenos and Amalric of Jerusalem blockade the city of Damietta in 1169. Amalric, quote, gave orders for the palm trees growing all about to be cut down and planed for use in the high-reaching towers. The lofty trees of leafy crowns were felled, the groves emptied of trees, and every garden stripped bare. But the fitting and joining together of the truss beams was never completed, for the king put off the work to be done over a period of days, ever waiting for tomorrow and never executing the measures that had been resolved upon. Again, there is a suggestion that this might be something Nikitas feels sad about. The trees are described in rich language, and the clear cut to him seems perhaps lamentable, especially in light of the fact that it was all for nothing. But in the next line, he writes that, quote, observing these things, Andronikos was vexed, which I had hoped would lead to some element of ecological grief, but it turns out that he was just vexed because the troops had no money and they were threatened with death by starvation. So again, we move immediately away from any emotional context for these trees. These examples are typical of the way in which deforestation is narrated, if it is narrated at all, in historiography. So it does not appear, at least judging from historiographical narratives, that at least elite Byzantines felt ecological grief at the ecosystemic level. But just as Manasses could grieve for the individual bird for whom he felt a special kinship, even if he couldn't grieve for the birds as a species, there was some evidence that Byzantines who did not grieve at the level of trees for species for trees were nevertheless grief-stricken at the level of the individual tree. Let's return for a moment to the clear cut of the No Vacancy Grove in Oregon with which I began. On October 22nd, the Corvallis Gazette reported on a memorial service held for the trees of the No Vacancy Grove. More than 120 people turned out on Sunday for a memorial service to honor a stand of old-growth trees cut down last May at Oregon State University's McDonald Dunn Research Forest. Dressed in parkas and puffy coats, my amendment here, this is the official uniform of Oregonians in autumn, the sober crowd packed into a large covered picnic shelter at Willamette Park in South Corvallis to sing songs, listen to poems, and mourn the passing of a grove that has become a symbol for changing public attitudes towards the university's forests. Death has called us together, intoned the Reverend Jill McAllister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Corvallis. The death of majestic trees, the deaths of a part of a small local ecosystem, and the death of some of our trust and some of our hope. Here, McAllister and the mourners speak evocatively of the trees as a group, but the focus of the ceremony, as you can see in the image, focuses in fact on this one tree, the oldest of them at 420 years. And here I quote again, at the end of the 45-minute service, audience members left flowers on the altar made from a polished round of wood cut from the oldest tree. The tree's growth rings were plainly visible, with paper labels pointing to the dates of historic events that occurred during the tree's long life, such as the Revolutionary War and the founding of Oregon State University, unquote. What makes this public display of grief notable is that trees are not usually considered as individuated beings with histories, lives, pasts, potential futures. That is, as beings in time with unique subjectivities. In giving the tree a biography, a history, they transform the chopping down of an object into the death of a subject, and thus from something non-grievable into something grievable, much in the same way that Manasses' lament for his bird features markers of the bird's individuality, his beautiful song, the way he is moved by discussions of Plato, the bird's jealousy when visitors come around. Manasses, again, forms an unlikely parallel, giving us one of the few examples of this kind of ecological grief as it relates to trees, or rather to a specific tree, in his monody for Nikiforos Komneni. In this, he tells us the sad story of an Arab gardener whose tree dies. Now he who has planted the tree and has been toiling for it, not bearing such a sight worthy of tears, takes his fellow farmers and makes them fellow mourners of the misfortune. And as though it were a dead man, He grieves over the tree and laments and besprinkles the ground with brine of tears. This oration is like the one for that tree, even though this is no Arabian fable. But the high-minded and noble Dukas, having cultivated a well-planted plant, I mean this good Komnenos, and tending him with the dews of education, gardening him with the moistures of wisdom, and irrigating him sufficiently with prowess drawn from books. The grief of the planter for his dead tree is os epinecrotophyto, like that for a dead man. And the tree in the story meets a threshold for grievable life. It is a sight worthy of tears. So here we have an example of a man grieving for a specific individuated tree, and his grief for the tree is as significant for him as the death of a beloved human is for Dukas. This oration is like the one for that tree, he says, making a kind of emotional parallel. One can grieve for a beloved tree as for a beloved human. Thus, though I've not been able to find any instances in which Byzantines grieved for ecosystems, this example demonstrates that at least they had the epistemological and affective framework for considering a tree to have a grievable life. The metaphor makes no sense unless Byzantines understood that a farmer could grieve for a tree as possessing a life, that is, as if it could die, like a human does. Indeed, this idea that a particular tree could be grievable is a central motif of another Byzantine text. Nikiforos Vasilakis, Progymnasma 51, what Eros might say upon seeing a woodcutter attempting to cut Mira while she is still pregnant with Adonis. Progymnasmata are, as a genre, are pedagogical exercises for students to practice their rhetorical skills, and progymnasmata themselves can be further subdivided into a variety of categories. In late antiquity and the Byzantine period, this exercise would have been characterized as an ethoporia, in which a writer was asked to imagine a kind of what-if situation, to practice imagining various writing scenarios. The background of this one is of a girl named Mira, who has sexual intercourse with her father and turns into a pregnant tree, which ends up giving birth to a human son, Adonis. Vasilakis has a different progymnasma narrating these events, but in this exercise he adopts the voice of Eros. Hold, O woodcutter, your axe. Do not strike your iron against Mira. For the narrator, Eros, this particular tree has a precarious life. It is a life that can be destroyed, and Eros is worried that it could die. This sense of grievable life, however, does not extend to all trees, as Eros makes clear in the next sentence. She is not an oak, a tree of the mountain dweller Pan, so that she might lie exposed to the stroke of the oak cutters. Nor is she an ash tree, the favorite of Ares, so that she might be cut by the iron, yet still grow back a sharp weapon. As with Manassas, bird, not all arboreal lives matter. Eros would not care if those other trees are chopped down, because they're ontologically different from him. Unlike this tree, quote, she is a beautiful girl that is put on the mask of a tree. Eros then makes the case for this tree's claim to life, and thus to inclusion within the human community of protection by arguing for its humanity. He devotes the middle section of his speech to the history and childhood of the girl, the piety of her father, their incest, and its consequences. Having given the tree an individuated history, Eros then addresses Ares, why do you arm a tree-cutting hand into bloodthirsty murder? Thus, chopping down this tree moves from a sanctioned act, cutting down a tree, to a banned act, murder, the murder of both Mira as tree with ontological human status and her as yet unborn son Adonis. This is, in a metaphorical sense, the essence of ecological grief. Where Oregon State University saw trees to be cut and sold for profit, the residents of the area saw a living being whom they did not want to see killed. And as in the case of the tree in the Vacancy Grove and Manassas' pet goldfinch, this tree is given a humanity by the one it loved, or by the one who loved it, rather. The problem of grievability has significant implications for what we think of when we think of nature writing and what we consider nature writing. While nature writing throughout history, including in Byzantium, has mostly been devoted to the topos of the locus amoenus, or in other Eden-like paradigms, nature writing in the age of anthropogenic climate change is written in the mode of lament and loss, rather than of beauty and peace. This shift to nature writing as lament stems from a recognition that non-human animals and plants have a life independent of human existence, and that this life is precarious, that this life can be injured. I would also argue that the recognition that nature and trees have grievable lives that can be narrated within anthropocentric discourses, that they have grievable lives independent of their association with humans, has consequences that we have yet to fully appreciate. The current climate crisis perhaps reveals to us the grief and loss already written into Byzantine nature writing, and which we, in better ecological conditions of the past, had not recognized. It thus allows for authors like Manasis and Vasilakis and other writers who write of ecological grief to be considered nature writers alongside those who describe nature's delights. But this recognition also has deep affective consequences for us, by which I mean us modern people, and also imposes upon us an ethical imperative as well. Seeing how Byzantines mourned trees may seem abstract, but one day, perhaps in our lifetime, some trees that were born or lived during the Byzantine era will die, and we'll have to mourn them also. And when we do, we may even feel moved to turn to the language of Eros in Vasilakis' Progymnasma. For when researchers in 2016 discovered Europe's oldest tree in the Pindos Mountains of modern-day Greece, a tree that at 1100 years old was born around the same time as Vasilakis, they gave it the name of Mira's son, Adonis. Thank you.
Thank you so much.